August 10th, 2024. And have to wonder what it actually sounded like when Brahma Sahampati came down and requested that the Buddha turn the wheel of the Dhamma. It probably sounded something similar to that. Very beautiful. We've all been pushing the envelope a little bit with the practice. We've had, so this morning, getting up early, morning puja, full day of practice. Sometimes I think, for myself, I've had this idea that, oh yeah, I can get back to my kuti and take a rest after the meal and take it easy and I'm going to feel better. And then whenever I'm able to do that, the mind is just more dull. But then at those times when I'm able to push through, maybe push myself harder than I normally would if I wasn't in the group, then the mind is brighter. And it just seems like that's the way to go, that's the way to practice. Yet there's always still this inclination, so much, just going to take a rest. But then, instead of doing that, continuing to practice, and especially times like after the meal, when there might be drowsiness, tiredness, fatigue, heaviness, especially after the very abundant meal today. And yet, practicing, I found, say, having a practice period after the meal, even though that practice period itself tends to be unpleasant, that paves the way for the mind to be brighter later in the day. And without that practice period after the meal or through the afternoon, when it's just maybe not that pleasant, maybe not that bright, maybe it is for some rare people, but that really does create the conditions for a bright mind in the evening. And morning puja, practicing early in the day, creates the conditions, paves the way for a bright mind later in the morning. And practicing after the meal creates the conditions for the bright mind later in the day. So we might experience a bright mind later in the day and think, well, I don't need to do that practice after the meal. I can just experience the bright mind later in the day. But then we haven't set up the conditions for it. I can remember having these good meditation experiences sometimes after I'd been working all day and I was exhausted and didn't want to go to evening puja, and then just going and just sitting and just not expecting very much, and then the mind becoming bright. And why is that? How does that work? What's going on there? I think part of it is when we come out of ourselves. So if we do a lot of service or we're just helping out, doing what needs to be done in the monastery, in that moment, we tend to not be thinking about ourselves, and the mind becomes bright. So when we're just helping out, helping others, being attentive to doing what needs to be done, the mind feels light, happy, radiant. And then when we're thinking about ourselves, I need to get rid of this and that defilement, and I need to develop this and that, it tends to get a bit heavy, grim even. When we think about ourselves a lot, it can be quite grim. It's like Longpa Samedo, the famous quote, "Whenever I think about myself, I get depressed." And if I think about myself, I've had so many times, so many mistakes, so many slip-ups in the past, so many misperceptions, can think back, oh, how could I have thought like that? How could I have said that? How could I have done that? Sometimes I wish that I could have just been programmed to be perfect in Dhamma Vinaya. Just get the implant, just get the brain implant, and be programmed to be perfect according to Dhamma Vinaya, but it just doesn't work that way. Sometimes I think things would be going well for a while and then get angry. I thought I was going to just let go of whatever was happening, no matter what, but then the irritation, the anger still comes up. I remember this happening one time when I was in Anagarika working in the kitchen in the original old house. We had a very small kitchen at that time. I think the original kitchen at Abhayagiri was probably just slightly bigger than the bathroom in the current kitchen. And sometimes katina, a lot of dishes, doing dishes all day. I remember cooking, and I was actually cooking with Metika, who, for anybody who knows Metika, she was quite a strong character sometimes, but I had a pretty good rapport with her. But then we had a bit of a conflict in the kitchen when I was in Anagarika. And she snapped at me, I snapped at her. We were getting snappy with each other, and speech-wise, using harsh speech. And I went and apologized. Later said, I'm surprised I fell into that. I don't want to be like that. And she said, well, it was kind of heartening. You're human. So that's why we make mistakes. It's because we're human. So we just have to learn. There's no way to just put the human heart in a box. We just have to learn over time. We have to train the mind, train the heart over a long period of time. For most of us, it's a very, very long time is needed, and we just have to learn. There's no shortcuts. Anytime we try to take a shortcut, it ends up taking longer. But it is interesting that when we undergo difficulties, we develop patience, the mind can become a bit more radiant. And so we practice at these times when we don't necessarily want to practice. That's the benefit of having a practice day where we all practice together. You're coming together after the mealtime, practicing through the afternoon, sitting meditation, walking meditation. And if we can practice like that at our kuti, say when we're on solitary retreat, or we go up to our dwelling place in the afternoon, and we can try to structure our time in that way. It's a little bit harder when we're not in the group. So it takes some further resources to structure our time in that way when we're on our own, but we will get the benefit if we do that. So if we experience the bright mind at a certain time of the day, we might think, oh yeah, well, if I only meditated at that time. And again, just repeating again that if we don't create the conditions, that's not going to happen. So we might have that experience that we take a rest, we take a nap, we take it easy after the meal, and then the mind isn't as bright in the afternoon when we try to meditate. So it's kind of like having a job. We might think, I only want to work on payday. I only want to work when I'm going to get paid. But then we don't get paid much at all. We have to work all those other days and not get paid, and then we get a big check on payday. Very much like that, very much the same with practice. So, and it's not just meditation, but it's service and trying to make things quality, trying to make our chanting quality, memorizing the chanting. That's a very good practice. Memorizing chanting, that's a good way to engage the mind. I spent a long time as an anagarika and a novice and junior monk doing walking meditation and just memorizing chanting. It's a great practice. Memorizing the Paritta chanting, memorizing the morning and evening chanting. And it really sharpens the mind, hones the mind, and it's bright, radiant. And then trying to do meditation when we're sick or fatigued from work. It can really brighten things up. That's getting overtime. That's getting paid overtime. I would think of practicing when you're sick as getting paid double time. So you want to get paid overtime and double time. And then mention at the tea time the other day, I think a good way to think about it, and it's worth repeating in the public talk. So you get paid overtime, you get paid double time, and then you get to the point where you start creating a good example for others and get others interested in practice, get others to practice. That's when you get promoted. That's when you make the big bucks. So I think it is a very good analogy for practice. But starting out in the monastery, it's just so much suffering. How can we even get to this point? I am amazed that I'm still here. I've probably wanted to almost disrobed, I would say, at least hundreds of times. But there's that faith or that confidence that just keep going. Just put one foot in front of the other. Just keep going. There's something, I guess for myself, there was always something in the back of the mind that, and part of it came from death contemplation. How lame would it be if I just disrobed and drove out of the monastery and just got hit by a car and died? So none of my aspirations or dreams or hopes fulfilled. And that would just be lame. Embarrassing. I guess I'd be embarrassed in my next life. But yeah, I mean, it could happen. We do a lot of death contemplation, and yeah, unlikely, but it's possible. Could happen. People drive fast on Tom Kai Road. They come careening around those blind corners. Luang Por got in an accident just 2 years ago. That was the first time we had one of our vehicles totaled just here on Tom Kai Road. Fortunately, nobody was hurt too bad, and very fortunately, nobody was killed. And Luang Por, he was the most hurt. He had the big bruise, internal bruising from the seatbelt. But the car was absolutely totaled. I was hit by a Humvee that was totally in the wrong lane. And they were texting. They were distracted. So even if we aren't distracted, all it takes is one other distracted person. And yeah, it can happen to anybody. So we just keep going, one foot in front of another. And recently was I think it was the end of June. Did a short tudong. Actually, yeah, mid-June, because it was we started on Ajahn Chah's birthday. And there was a few days where we were just walking on the highway for hours straight. I think one day we walked for 4 or 5 hours without stopping. And it just seems to be going on, and there's no real end in sight. And then it shifts, and then it shifts. And there's this idea that, well, we got offered plenty of alms food this one day, and then had our meal in kind of a nice spot, and then we keep walking, and we're carrying weight, maybe 30 pounds of weight, not taking a rest, but just walking and feeling pretty good. And why can't we do that at our dwelling places in the monastery? Walk up the hill and get right onto the walking meditation path and do 4 hours of walking meditation. Why can't we do that? Essentially, that's what we were doing. And carrying weight, it's like doing 4 hours of walking meditation while carrying a 30-pound pack. So it should be easier to go up to our kuti, our dwelling place, and do 4 hours, 3 hours, 2 hours even of walking meditation without it carrying any weight, but somehow when we're on our own and the conditions don't really demand it, then it's easy to just take it a little bit too easy, take a bit too much of a rest, and then things aren't as bright, things aren't as polished. So sometimes when we're pushed into situations, it can be a really good thing. And there's that skill of just learning how to push ourselves. There's a story of Longpa Liam that the Wat Nong Pa Pong monks tell. It's kind of just one of these word-of-mouth stories. It's not talked about very much, but where there was something that needed to be fixed in this kuti that was built for Longpo Cha. And then Ajahn Liam, he never would ask for help. But he just went, and it was some sort of plumbing issue. And he went, and he just quietly worked through the afternoon. And it seems the Wat Pa Pong way is just to go until it's done. So, and he was working there until about 1 a.m, fixing this issue, and then the next day he's just going about his business as usual. And he just lives his life that way. That's how he lives his life. And whenever you meet up with Ajahn Liam, Longpa Liam, for those who don't know, Longpa means venerable, it's Thai for venerable father. Ajahn means teacher. It comes from the word acharya in Pali. So in Thai that becomes Ajahn, or teacher. And so we can call him Ajahn Liam or Longpa, which is more like he's older and very senior and highly, highly revered, respected. So we call him Longpa Liam. And he lives his life in this way of self-sacrifice and not really having any consideration for if it's going to be comfortable for himself or not. And yet when you meet him, he's absolutely just radiant, just so radiant all the time. And just really metta kind of coming off of him, just goodwill and this kind of brightness. And it's just helpful to see things like that. It's very encouraging. Just to have examples like that to reflect on and to recollect when we feel like maybe things are a bit bleak, or it's just the kind of humdrum routine, the day in, day out at the monastery. Then to recollect that, well, that's with that cultivation of the practice, the virtue, the precepts, the self-sacrifice. Add to that the meditation, the constantly reflecting on Dhamma, constantly checking in with the heart, always lifting up the mindfulness, always attentive to the precepts with a sense of hiriotapa, which means like a strong sense of conscience, a strong sense of right and wrong that we develop over time through the practice. Unshakable. Somebody like Longpa Liam is just absolutely unshakable. You could even say there's nothing to be shaken. So for somebody who's had insight into not self, there's nowhere that can be shaken. It's absolutely transcendent. There's other kinds of teachings. There's Longpa Apasano talked about once a teaching that is a very short teaching, but it stuck with me, and it was during a Dhamma talk years ago. And he was talking about how you don't need to wait till you're meditating for the mind to settle or for the mind to become one-pointed. It'll do that according to its own nature, based on just our efforts in the practice with the keeping the precepts, the cultivation of the virtue, the daily meditation practice. And he said he had this experience where he was chanting. He was just during evening chanting at Wat Pah Pong, and he was a more junior monk, and the mind unifying and settling into a very deep state of peace during the chanting, and being able to continue chanting. It's not that he had to stop chanting. And just having that insight that, oh, chanting is not an obstacle to having a very peaceful mind, to having a settled mind. It's not that we wait for the chanting to be done and then we can settle. That we settle while we're doing the chanting. Or we can settle before we're doing the chanting. Or we can settle as we're coming into the Dhamma hall to do the chanting. And then we see that we can actually be settled all the time if we're always recollecting in this way. Bowing. The mind can unify while we're bowing. It can develop a sense of faith and devotion and respect. It's incredibly bright, incredibly wholesome qualities. Then, of course, we're going to slip up, we're going to make mistakes. We can't do this all the time. We can't be peaceful and calm and wise and skillful all the time. And so there's going to be times where we do slip, where we do fall, and we just get up, one foot in front of the other, keep going, dust ourselves off, keep going. So I'm grateful to have been able to be a part of the full day of practice today and to have been able to share a few things, and I think I'll just leave it at that this evening.